The truth is far more complicated. Because each of them went in a completely different direction. One became a king against his own wishes. One gave up the throne for love. And one left the world before even reaching adulthood. Behind it all were losses and pressures the royal family once tried to keep in silence. Their lives were nothing alike, yet each one was shaped by choices that changed the entire Windsor dynasty. And what happened at the end of each destiny is something that always makes people stop. Let us lift the veil of secrecy and step into the true story of the 6 children of King George V. Number 6. Edward VIII. His full name was Edward Albert Christian George, Andrew Patrick, David Windsor. He was born on June 23, 1894 at Sandringham, during a time when the British Empire stood at the height of its power. As the eldest son of King George V and Queen Mary, he was placed into the role of heir to the throne from the moment he lay in his cradle. Within the family, everyone called him David. But no one knew that the future king began his childhood with a loneliness entirely his own. From his earliest years, Edward grew up in the long, cold corridors of Marlborough House. The sound of the supervisor's shoes echoed each morning like a reminder that he was not allowed to make mistakes. Everything he did, the way he stood, the way he bowed his head, the way he smiled, was taught to match the image of a future king. Some nights, the little boy sat by the window, looking out into the dark garden, wondering why he had to be strong when he still did not understand the world. But that hardship was only the beginning. Edward's teenage years passed beneath the pressure of King George V and Queen Mary, 2 perfect figures he was expected to follow. The public watched his every step. The newspapers waited for every expression. Edward understood that a normal childhood was not in his future. A prince beloved by crowds. But a boy is slowly losing himself, and everything became heavier when he entered the rigid world of the Royal Navy. At Osborne and later at Dartmouth, Edward endured nights standing in the cold as punishment for mistakes in drills. His coat was soaked with mist. His hands were shaking from the freezing air. He once wrote letters saying he was not suited for this life, but he stayed silent because an heir was not allowed to be weak. The shadow of duty grew larger, and Edward could not escape it. But what happened next became the haunting that followed him for the rest of his life. When the First World War broke out, Edward received an honorary military rank and was sent to France. But he was forbidden from going to the front lines, too dangerous for an heir to the throne. In the muddy trenches, he knelt beside injured young soldiers, listening to them speak about comrades who had just died before their eyes. And a painful feeling rose within him. He was only a symbol, not a real soldier. That sense of not being enough became a wound he carried throughout his life. But the irony is that those years in the trenches opened a completely different chapter for him. After the war, Edward stepped into the world like light after a long storm. Wherever he appeared, from the mist-covered squares of Canada to the red dust streets of India, crowds erupted. People pushed forward just to see him, to wave to him, to hear the warm voice they believed could ease the turbulence of the era. Behind his friendly smile lay a warmth rarely found, a warmth that contrasted with the sternness of King George V. But the more he was celebrated, the more Edward felt the emptiness his childhood had left behind. An emptiness that made him seek tenderness in places the royal family had never offered. And that emptiness led him to the woman who shook an empire. Wallis Simpson, an American woman. Someone who had known heartbreak. And in her eyes, Edward felt something the throne could never give him. He was seen as a person, not a symbol. After only a few meetings, Wallis became his only emotional refuge. The closer he drew to her, the farther he drifted from the royal family. And destiny truly began when George V died. On January 20th, 1936, Edward became king as Edward VIII. But within the first year of his reign, his relationship with Wallis erupted into a constitutional crisis the kingdom had never witnessed. The government opposed it. The church opposed it. The Commonwealth opposed it. A king could not marry a divorced woman whose former husband was still alive. It was a rule that could not be broken. Edward stood between 2 roads that could never be reconciled: the throne or love. And what happened next made the world fall silent. In December 1936, at Fort Belvedere, Edward signed the Abdication document. The soft touch of the pen on the stone table was a slight sound, yet enough to end an entire reign. The next day, he addressed the nation. "I cannot carry out my duties without the woman I love." A single sentence that shook the world and marked the beginning of his life in exile. However, the years following his abdication revealed most clearly the loneliness he had always carried within him. Edward was granted the title Duke of Windsor. He left Britain, lived in France, served as governor of the Bahamas during the Second World War, and then returned to Paris, where he lived among grand parties, never finding a place that felt like home. Though he had everything, wealth, titles, the freedom to love, he still carried the feeling of belonging nowhere. The royal family kept their distance. His rare returns to England felt like fragments of old memories, scattered and cold. Edward became the brother far away, familiar yet never fully welcomed back. A king without a throne. A man standing outside his own family. In 1972, Edward died in Paris from throat cancer at the age of 77. His body was returned to Windsor and laid to rest at Frogmore, closing the life of the man who once changed the direction of an entire monarchy. But the legacy of Edward VIII never stopped. He was the man who gave up the throne for love, a choice that paved the way for the era of George VI, then Elizabeth II, and the image of the modern monarchy that followed. It is the story of a beloved prince, a controversial king, and a man whose loneliness stretched from childhood until his final days. And the one who rose from the ruins of that story, he was his younger brother. And that journey, it is an entirely different story. Number 5. Albert Frederick. Arthur George was born on December 14, 1895, at York Cottage in Sandringham. He was the second son of King George V and Queen Mary, standing just behind Crown Prince Edward, the one the nation believed was destined to become king. But from his earliest years, Albert already carried a very personal hardship. A stutter, appearing when he was still a child, brought embarrassment every time he had to speak. Along with that were his knock-knees, which needed braces, his chronic stomach pains, and a shyness that made him hide behind his brother at family events. His relatives called him Bertie, a small and warm name, fitting for the quiet boy who always bowed his head. From these earliest years, Bertie's path carried a soft but deep sadness, one he would spend a lifetime learning to fight. Not bombs. Not a dramatic loss. But wounds that were hard to put into words. The fear of crowds. The shame of stumbling on every sentence. And the belief that he was somehow less than his siblings. He did not yet know that this silence would one day lead him to a place no one could have imagined. As time passed and the spotlight shone brighter on Edward, the shadow around Albert grew heavier. Edward was charming, confident, and adored by the public. He appeared in newspapers, on royal tours, and in the cheers of crowds. And Bertie, whenever he walked beside him, kept the habit of stepping half a pace behind, as if avoiding every gaze. There were evenings at the Sandringham dining table when Edward told stories with excitement, while Albert stared down at the tablecloth, fingers gently holding his spoon, terrified he might be asked to speak. And when he did speak, the words caught, his face flushed. A small moment, but one that stretched across his entire childhood. Still, there were small patches of light. Bertie liked neatness, gentle sports, and long quiet hours spent watching the clock. These tiny pleasures became his emotional anchors, helping him stay steady whenever his voice failed him. But that fragile calm did not last. In his teenage years, he was sent to the Royal Navy's training institutions. Bertie entered the Royal Naval College, then served on the battleship Collingwood. It was a period that marked his passage into adulthood, but it was also where he continued to face the old wounds of childhood. On deck, when he had to shout orders or give reports, his words stalled again. Yet he kept trying, working so hard that he was allowed to take part in the Battle of Jutland, one of the significant battles of the First World War. Amid cannon fire and smoke drifting across the sea, Bertie stood in the control room, sweat on his cheeks, eyes fixed on the signals. No one called him a hero, but his comrades said he performed every duty with an almost obsessive precision, as if he were using every small detail to compensate for the insecurity he carried. When the war ended, Albert transferred to the Royal Air Force and became one of the first royals to earn a pilot's certificate. It was a time when a softer light returned to him. Less pressure, more hope. Perhaps even the period when he felt the most normal. But ahead of him lay a turn no one could have predicted. A brighter light appeared when he met Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, the woman who brought him a gentleness he had never known. Elizabeth became the most important presence in his life, helping him believe he did not always have to walk behind others. Their wedding in 1923 marked the beginning of a new chapter, one in which Bertie was no longer alone. With Elizabeth, he had two daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret, opening doors to a warm family life few royals ever experienced. But this happiness had barely formed before the most significant upheaval of his life struck. In 1936, after the death of King George V, Edward VIII ascended the throne. The nation expected much from the new king, but then Edward shocked the world by choosing to abdicate to marry Wallis Simpson, an American woman who had been divorced. The country fell into political turmoil. And when the throne was suddenly left empty, only one person could take it, Albert. Images from those days remain. A tense face, anxious eyes, fingers twisting together as he spoke. The man who had once trembled before a microphone now had to become the voice of an empire. And in that moment, the life that had once been overshadowed by insecurity changed completely. As King George VI, he faced the greatest challenge of the century, World War II. London fell under bombardment. On some days, explosions shattered the glass of Buckingham Palace. Shards scattered across the floor. Dust filled the air. And George VI stood in the middle of the destruction, dust on his shoulder, looking toward the window where smoke drifted into the gray sky. It was a cinematic moment people spoke of for years. But what made the public love him most were his visits to the bombed neighborhoods. He and Queen Elizabeth walked over broken bricks, speaking to the residents with a voice that sometimes still stumbled, but was always sincere. Yet standing firm through the war came with a price no one saw at first. The war ended, but George VI's health declined sharply. He had smoked heavily during the war, worsening his lung condition. Still, he continued to work and represent the kingdom. Until the morning of February 6, 1952, at Sandringham, when George VI passed away in his sleep from coronary thrombosis. He was only 56. His death left the nation in quiet shock. Many wept beside their radios. And that moment of silence closed one life, but opened a legacy that endures. His legacy was unmistakable. A symbol of resilience in wartime, and a spirit of duty he passed down to Elizabeth II, the daughter who would become the defining monarch of the next century. Among the 6 children of King George V, George VI was the one who seemed the weakest, yet became the strongest pillar of all. A life ended. But his quiet strength continued to guide an entire dynasty. Number 4. Victoria Alexandra. Alice Mary was born on April 25, 1897, at York Cottage in Sandringham. She was the third child of King George V and Queen Mary, and the only daughter in a family of 6 siblings. Her 2 older brothers, Edward and Albert, were prepared for the more prominent roles in life. Her 3 younger brothers, Henry, George, and John, followed after. Within the family, they simply called her Mary. This very position shaped her role. She was not the heir, but she was the one expected to uphold the steady rhythm of royal tradition. However, that stability was only skin-deep. Behind Mary was a life shaped by responsibilities that were often invisible to others. Mary's childhood unfolded as the British monarchy entered the early years of the 20th century. She was educated at home under a curriculum personally supervised by Queen Mary. She studied history, literature, French, music, and needlework. Her tutors noted that Mary always completed every lesson precisely as required. She never tried to stand out, but she never left mistakes either. She loved sewing from a young age, spending hours making doll clothes or small gifts for her brothers. A simple habit, but one that appeared again and again in the records of the time. While her older brothers lived in the spotlight, Mary grew up quietly. And from that quietness, she began to sense the weight of fame settling over her family. Mary's home life was constantly under public scrutiny. King George V was disciplined to the extreme, and Queen Mary was the embodiment of royal formality. Mary grew up watching her parents work tirelessly through ceremonies, audiences, and state duties. As a child, she often stood behind Queen Mary during hospital or school visits. These outings became familiar to her, and she accepted the lack of privacy as part of her duty. But destiny had not yet spared the only daughter of the family. In 1914, the First World War began. Mary was only 17, but she quickly stepped into the role of a wartime royal. She visited military hospitals, spoke with wounded soldiers, and joined women preparing supplies for the front. That same year, Mary created Princess Mary's Christmas Gift Fund, meant to send Christmas gifts to every British soldier on the battlefield. More than 2 million boxes were delivered during the winter of 1914. Images of Mary signing each parcel were recorded in many documents of the time and remained a vivid memory for soldiers returning home. However, in the midst of that wartime atmosphere, Mary faced a sorrow that the public never fully understood. Her youngest brother, Prince John, had epilepsy and developmental difficulties. He lived apart from the rest of the family at Wood Farm on the Sandringham estate. Mary was one of the few siblings who regularly sent letters, gifts, and visited him. In 1919, at just 13 years old, Prince John died after a seizure. The news was kept quiet, and the family rarely spoke of it. However, records indicate that Mary spent more time with Queen Mary during those days and continued working in post-war relief programs with renewed determination. That loss marked her first deep emotional turning point, and it became the foundation for her lifelong commitment to service. The 1920s marked Mary's full emergence into adulthood. She became patron of numerous hospitals, women's organizations, nursing groups, and veteran support centers. She frequently appeared in regions where royal visits were rare, particularly in northern England, where she carried out duties on behalf of the monarchy. Her calm and steady presence made her one of the most recognized royal figures of this era. And during these crucial years, another change awaited her. In 1922, Mary married Henry Lascelles, who would later become the Earl of Harewood. Their wedding at Westminster Abbey drew significant public attention. Afterward, Mary moved to Harewood House in Yorkshire, a vast estate with a lifestyle vastly different from that of London. Their two sons, George in 1923 and Gerald in 1924, arrived soon after. Mary was described as a disciplined mother, always present during lessons and writing practice. But behind this stable family life were shadows few ever spoke of. Henry was a reserved man, sometimes cold, and any tension inside the family remained tightly private. Mary continued her public duties without interruption. In 1932, she was granted the title Princess Royale, the highest honor bestowed upon the daughter of a monarch. It solidified her position in the royal family and reflected King George V's trust in her. But a far greater upheaval was drawing near, one that would reshape the entire structure of Mary's family. In 1936, King George V died. Edward ascended to the throne as Edward VIII, but abdicated months later to marry Wallis Simpson, triggering an unprecedented constitutional crisis. Mary kept a low profile in the press, but she was one of the family's most stabilizing forces during the turmoil. Her brother Albert became King George VI under immense pressure. Mary helped restore the monarchy's presence in the north, where she had deep ties. And then, once again, war pulled her back into the storm. The Second World War began in 1939. Mary resumed her wartime roles, joining auxiliary territorial service activities, visiting camps, wartime hospitals, and munitions factories. Part of Harewood House was used for military logistics. Mary visited many families who had suffered loss, maintaining the same steady presence she had during the First World War. These years pushed her endurance to its limits. After the war, Mary entered a quieter but still busy period. In 1947, Henry Lascelles became the 6th Earl of Harewood, but he died the same year, leaving Mary a widow at age 50. Even so, she continued supporting hospitals, nursing schools, and charities for decades. She remained close to Queen Elizabeth II and represented the royal family at many key events in northern England. However, behind the rhythm of her public life, Mary's health was slowly declining. In her final years, she suffered from heart problems. She spent more time with her family but continued to participate in select charitable activities. On March 28, 1965, Mary died at Harewood House at the age of 67. Her funeral was simple, held in the estate's chapel. It was the end of a life that was never loud, yet never stepped away from duty. Princess Mary is remembered as one of the most steadfast members of the royal family in the 20th century. From the First World War to the Second, from the Abdication crisis of 1936 to the early years of Elizabeth II's reign, Mary appeared whenever and wherever the monarchy needed presence. To the soldiers who received a gift box in 1914, to the patients she visited, and to the women she encouraged during wartime service, Mary became a symbol of quiet, enduring service, an image that lasted nearly half a century. And that journey ends here. The next child of King George V has a story of an entirely different kind. Number 3. Henry William Frederick Albert was born in the spring of 1900 at York Cottage in Sandringham. From his very first steps, the weak legs strapped in metal braces made his childhood different from that of his stronger siblings. He was the third son of King George V and Queen Mary, growing up between two older brothers destined to become kings and younger brothers whose lives would later take their own separate paths. Henry was often ill, with a voice that was high and slightly lisping. Queen Mary loved him deeply, but she once wrote that this son required special care because his health and nerves were not as robust as those of his siblings. While his older brothers stood proudly at the front during ceremonies, Henry was used to appearing behind them, where fewer eyes turned to look. Yet in the middle of this fragility, the evenings at Sandringham held a gentle image. A little boy with braced legs, sitting at a small desk, writing a letter about scoring a goal at school, as if it were the happiest moment of his day. A small ray of light that carried hope, even though many challenges still waited ahead. As time passed, Henry grew up within a rhythm where every gesture was linked to duty. He was not the heir, but he was not free from royal expectations either. His position, neither bright enough to shine nor distant enough to disappear, created a quiet, reflective space in his life. And when he left the protection of the palace to attend boarding school, something no prince had done before, Henry stepped into a world entirely unfamiliar. In the noisy dormitory, surrounded by strong and energetic boys, he often stood still for a moment before joining the group. A small moment, but one full of meaning. A young prince learning how to find his place in a wider, louder world. Gradually, boarding school gave him the confidence that palace life had never offered. And this was only the beginning of larger changes to come. During his youth on aristocratic hunting trips to Kenya, Henry met Beryl Markham, a woman strong, independent, and free. Their connection came naturally, born from two people longing for a life unconfined by ceremony. But time did not stand with them. When Beryl's husband considered naming Henry in his divorce filing, he was immediately recalled to England, and the relationship had to end in silence. Henry continued supporting her privately for years to keep their story from reaching the public. A quiet, deeply emotional turning point that left a soft sadness in his early adulthood. Like many royal men of his time, Henry built his life around the military. But unlike others, he preferred to stand a step behind, observing more than seeking attention. He joined the King's Royal Rifle Corps, then the 10th Royal Hussars, the regiment he cared for most. He was not the brightest officer, but he was steady, diligent, and quiet. During the Second World War, as bombs echoed across Europe, Henry visited the bombed regions of France, standing in shattered villages, listening to soldiers describe long and difficult days. He observed with the eyes of a man seeking understanding, not praise. The letters he wrote to his wife after each inspection were simple, describing life in the camps and the tired faces he met, but never mentioning his own fears. Those days gave Henry a sense of purpose, a feeling that he was standing exactly where he could be helpful. But changes within the royal family soon redirected his path. After the war, the abdication of Edward VIII shifted Henry's position dramatically. As the third son, he suddenly became the only adult immediately behind George VI. If anything had happened before Princess Elizabeth came of age, Henry would have become regent. The responsibility was rarely spoken aloud, but it pressed on him every day. He had to leave the military, the part of life he loved most, and step more fully into royal duty. In the following years, Henry was appointed Governor-General of Australia. The role brought him out of the palace's shadow and into a vast nation rising from the ruins of war. During his journeys across rural regions, Henry maintained his characteristic modesty, listening to farmers discuss their land, the weather, and their struggles. His calm, straightforward presence offered stability to communities still healing. For Henry, it was a rare, bright chapter, a time when he was not the brother of two kings, but simply himself. But then Henry's health began to decline. In middle age, he continued with royal duties, but those close to him noticed the slowing of his movements. And in the winter of 1965, after the funeral of Winston Churchill, years of strain revealed themselves. On the drive back to Barnwell Manor, Henry suffered a stroke while holding the steering wheel. The car veered off the road. Lady Alice was severely injured and required hours of surgery. Henry never fully recovered. Once able to attend major ceremonies, he withdrew into a quieter life. Each passing stroke made speaking, walking, and even small daily tasks more difficult. From Barnwell Manor, Henry watched the world move forward without him, as if he stood slightly outside the flow of time. However, the most profound and most painful change in his life was still to come. In August 1972, Prince William, his eldest son, was killed in an air racing accident. The crash was sudden, and William did not survive. Because Henry's health was so fragile, Lady Alice hesitated to tell him. It is believed that he learned the truth from the evening news. The image of the aging father, hand trembling from stroke, quietly looking at the screen, became one of the most somber moments of his final years. After that day, Henry never appeared in public again. What remained was the patient care of his family in those last years. 2 years later, Henry died at Barnwell Manor at the age of 74. He was the last surviving son of King George V to live into the 1970s. Dramatic achievements did not mark his life, but by duty, quiet composure, and steady steps behind two brothers who became defining kings of the century. He was the only royal prince to govern the Australian territory, a soldier who witnessed more than most people realized, and a father who carried silent sorrows that words could never fully capture. Soft and steady, like a stream flowing past the significant events of his era, Henry's life left behind the enduring image of a man who lived through responsibility more than through words, and who kept moving forward even when the road was difficult. Number 2. George Edward Alexander Edmund was born on December 20th, 1902, at York Cottage in Sandringham. He was the fifth child of King George V and Queen Mary. And from the earliest years of his life, a quiet sense of sadness seemed to shadow him. The youngest brother he loved most would not live past the age of 13. That loss had not yet happened when he entered the world, but it hovered ahead like a faint echo, giving his childhood a calm and melancholic undertone. Within the family, George was the gentle one, the sensitive one. They called him Georgie. Amid the strict household of Queen Mary, his tenderness toward Prince John, who struggled with epilepsy and lived almost entirely apart, became one of the rare warm lights in the family. There were afternoons when George sat with John in the Sandringham garden, slowly turning the pages of a picture book while the last light of day fell across their shoulders. A small moment, yet unforgettable to anyone who saw it. But moments like that could never hold back what was coming. Unlike his older brothers, who always stood at the front of royal ceremonies, George carried a quieter presence, like someone who naturally stepped half a pace back to observe the world. Among three older siblings who each represented a familiar royal archetype, George felt like an unusual note. Soft, artistic, slightly elusive. He loved music, interiors, fashion, languages, sailing, skiing. London noticed his style so much that the double-breasted Kent jacket was named after him. But behind the polished exterior was someone carrying many things he never said aloud. In 1919, the emotional blow finally arrived. Prince John died at 13. John had been closest to George, and the loss settled onto him like a long, silent shadow. In a family that did not show emotion, George kept the grief inside and walked into adulthood more reserved, more inward, more contemplative. And he had no idea how many turns still waited ahead. While his older brothers took familiar royal paths, George chose a life that felt different. He began at the Royal Naval College, served on British warships, and then became the first royal prince to work as a civil servant at the Foreign Office and later the Home Office. These were roles that required discipline, humility, and meticulous attention. Roles no royal had taken before. His world shifted again when he and Princess Marina moved into 3 Belgrave Square in London. George designed the interiors himself, choosing the lamps, the fabrics, the details. Belgrave Square soon became a quiet social center before the war. In those evenings, with soft music playing and warm light settling on polished wood, George looked at ease in a way he rarely did elsewhere. But that peace was only temporary. Later accounts often mention the complexity of George's private life. Relationships with women, relationships with men, rumors of his struggles with morphine or cocaine. No one knows the full truth, but the stories reveal a man who was both gentle and yearning to be understood while locked inside the rigid expectations of the monarchy. And that was only one part of his inner landscape. Then came 1934, the brightest turning point. George married Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark. Elegant, calm, beloved by London. Their wedding at Westminster Abbey became the first royal ceremony broadcast live on radio. In that golden space, with the choir rising above them, George walked at the center of national attention. But even a moment like that could not last. When the Second World War began, George returned to serve as an air commodore in the Royal Air Force. He worked in training and naval intelligence in assignments rarely discussed publicly. On the bases, he walked among young pilots preparing to fly into the night, speaking in a deep, slow, reassuring voice that contrasted sharply with the tension of wartime. But the war carried its own risks. In the summer of 1942, George boarded a Sunderland flying boat on a foggy morning for a mission to Iceland. The plane took off and vanished into the mist. When it crashed into Eagles Rock in Caithness, 14 people were killed. George was 39. A quiet end that matched his quiet nature, yet left behind a sorrow that stayed with the royal family for decades. And questions surrounding the crash still linger. In London, Princess Marina held her 7-week-old baby as she received the news. She lived on with grace, raising their 3 children and preserving the memory of a man many now consider one of the most modern princes of the 20th century. George was laid to rest at Frogmore, near the resting place of Queen Victoria. Tall trees, soft wind, pale stone. A peaceful corner for a life that was short but full of depth, contrasts, and unmistakable individuality. He left behind 3 young children. He left behind the image of a prince who was elegant, artistic, and quietly brave enough to live truthfully, even when caught between duty and freedom. He also left the legacy of being the first British royal prince to serve as a civil servant, a symbol of a modern Windsor spirit. When people look back, George, Duke of Kent, appears like clear, deep water. Still, honest, and impossible to mistake for anyone else. Number 1. Prince John Charles Francis was born on July 12, 1905, at York Cottage. As the youngest child, he stood behind 5 older siblings who carried the heavy expectations of the dynasty. But only a few years later, when he was 4, the first epileptic seizure appeared. It quietly opened a path that was completely different from what anyone had imagined for a young prince. The family called him Johnny. He was gentle, affectionate, sometimes slower than other children his age, but always cheerful in a way that made people smile. Once, after seeing his father kiss his mother, he whispered, "She kissed Papa, ugly old man," and the whole family laughed at his innocence. Moments like that were beautiful and brief, like a soft breath of peace before the shadows began to move closer. By the time he turned 6, doctors understood that bringing him out before crowds could trigger a seizure at any moment. A prince could not lose control in public. It was a silent pressure John never knew existed, but it shaped his entire childhood. And what followed weighed even heavier on the family. At 7, the seizures grew more frequent. The family moved him to Wood Farm, a small house apart from Sandringham. With him went Lala Bill, the nanny who had cared for him since he was an infant. She wrote that whenever he suffered a seizure, his siblings were so heartbroken they could not even stand beside him. It was the first time in the family that a child had to live away from his own siblings. A medically necessary decision, but one that left an unspoken emptiness. Even so, there were small rays of light in that separation. Queen Alexandra, his grandmother, planted a garden just for him. John wandered from tree to tree, watched zeppelins drift across the gray sky, and walked with his little friend Winifred Thomas, the daughter of the stableman. Those gentle moments made Wood Farm a place where he could breathe more freely. But they did not last. In the years that followed, his health fluctuated. Some days he would run across the yard, hugging his dog and calling for Lala Bill to show her a strange leaf he had found. Other days, the seizures kept him lying still in bed, his face pale in the dim yellow light of the small room. That became the rhythm of his world. A quiet morning, then an afternoon overtaken by another seizure. There was no school, no ceremonies, none of the expectations his siblings lived under. John grew up in a world that was small, gentle, and sheltered. And it was that difference that made him a soft, quiet light in the memories of those who knew him. However, the story had not yet reached its most challenging moment. After Christmas in 1918, he was well enough to have lunch with the family. Queen Mary described it in her diary as a rare, peaceful day. But only weeks later, worrying signs returned. By early 1919, each seizure lasted longer. Then, on the afternoon of January 18th, while playing in the garden, he collapsed from a major seizure. Lala Bill ran to him, lifted him in her arms, carried him inside, and laid him on his bed. The yellow lamp cast a warm glow across his face. His small body slowly softened in her hands. No sound. No movement. A moment so still, you could hear the wind slipping through the doorframe. It was a moment the family would never forget. Prince John died at 5:30 that evening, at only 13 years old. When King George and Queen Mary arrived at Wood Farm, they saw their youngest lying peacefully, his face so calm that newspapers later described it as an angelic smile. Queen Mary wrote in her diary that it was the first break in the family circle, a short line that revealed a grief she never showed in public. His funeral was held quietly at St. Mary Magdalene, attended only by his family and a few who had cared for him on the estate. A grave covered with flowers. No ceremony. No crowd. Only a quiet farewell for a boy who had never asked for a place in the royal family. In the years that followed, Queen Mary sent Winifred, his little friend, a few of the books he had loved with the note, "In memory of our dear little prince." And Lala Bill kept a photo of John and a hurried note reading, "Nanny, I love you," on her mantelpiece until the day she died. These small, tender memories became John's true legacy. He did not live long enough to build a life or a career. But his story became a window into how early 20th century society treated children with epilepsy and developmental challenges. When the records were released decades later, people no longer saw John as the hidden prince. Still, as a boy, his family did their best to protect him within the limits of medical knowledge and social expectations at the time. Prince John, the youngest child of King George V, passed away early. But he left behind an image impossible to forget. A fragile, loving child, cherished in quiet ways, living his entire life in a small world where affection mattered more than ceremony.